Now people can't see. That's the problem. I knew there was a reason I didn't put it.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll be getting started in just 1 minute. Van, are you ready to begin? It's 10:04.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you to this event here at Humber College and hybrid online with Zoom. This is a really special event. I'm really excited to get into it, but we're going to start first with a land acknowledgement from Michelle Robinson.
Oh, great. I'm really honored to be here, folks. So thank you for having me. I'm seeing the notice saying low systems resources, so I apologize. I hope it's coming through clear. Oki Naganago Mekoche Chestokom Aki or Dekot Nagotine Siku. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11. My name is Dekot Nagotine Siku. My people wore rabbit skin, so it's been referred to as the land of the hair people. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene Nation is a visitor to this area of Clincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot Mohkinstsis, as Michelle Elliott, an English name, which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. Through my father, I'm a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution while having a Canadian Indian Act imposed status card, which is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit, or the Indigenous 2S LGBTQ+ community, and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the Canadian socio-economic ladder because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous, but I share a little bit about my journey as I walk the red road. As a Dene woman, I've even attempted to run. I've joined harmful colonial parties, spent money to be at expensive conventions, left my home to travel to those conventions just to vote on incomplete policies that still allow for incarceration, a denial of justice, denial of health services, racism, colonial trauma, and genocide of Indigenous and Black peoples. So I see my work that I have to continue and reports to advocate for and attempt to work within these systems meant to harm me and my community. I think of all of this today and hope that we honor the many Indigenous lives lost for this so-called country named Canada. I hope you see your role in the importance of stopping harm, and as a citizen, see your role in reconciliation and as a treaty partner. Pride Month should never be one month. It's important to understand that the straight agenda and gendered violence was and is forced on this land by Christian outsiders. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as a guest and then acknowledging your role as a treaty partner in a so-called time of reconciliation. It's important land acknowledgements have that meaning. I encourage you all to introduce yourself with an acknowledgement of your ancestors, stories of displacement, and how you perceive your role as a treaty partner, a citizen of Canada, a refugee, or other land displacements. So we as Indigenous people know how safe you are to be around. If you don't know how to pronounce your local Indigenous names, if you don't say your pronouns, won't say your story of origin, won't acknowledge stolen lands, won't acknowledge imposed economic oppression or your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around my community, my family, and myself. Understanding land acknowledgements and their importance is Indigenous 101 because it immediately addresses colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and lies taught today in Canadian schools nationally. That's why settlers and those who call themselves Native Calgarians or whatever town you might be from, show me that you don't have Indigenous 101. Jesse Wente's book, Unreconciled, explains this perfectly, as do many other Indigenous authored books. Land Back is a movement that could save the planet from climate change created by colonialism, but it would also be a part of that treaty partnership and meaningful reconciliation and honoring global initiatives like the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. I honor the Blackfoot and the elders as the members have been kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Blackfoot, and Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Satu Dene. My humblest apologies to any Blackfoot and Dene language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. So I'm speaking to you on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the opposed US-Canadian border are the Blackfeet, north of the border are the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877. The signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, Bearspaw Nations of the Stoney, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. I sure wish you have a wonderful conference today, and I thank you so much for being a part of it. Masicho.
I was muted there. I was just saying, thank you for that. That was lovely and quite powerful. I'm Daniel Baer. I'm one of the hosts today. This is an event hosted in part by Humber College and Humber's Center for Social Innovation, UBC out on the West Coast there, and right in between the two at the University of Calgary. This is a really great event, and I'm so excited to have you all here. I just wanted to let you know a couple things before we dive into some more of the content. This is being recorded, and so we will be putting this up on some shared channels later on, hopefully. There's no media here that I'm aware of, but we did invite a few, but that's a whole other story, I guess. And I just wanted to let you know that we've turned on closed captioning to try and make this as accessible as possible to everyone. Today's event is really special and one that could not happen, I think, 5 years ago even. Today, we're celebrating the 4th anniversary of cannabis legalization. And I have to say, as someone who's been working in this field for about 20 years now almost, I did not imagine that scenes like this would be possible or normal, or that we would be here at Humber College, which is on the land of the Anishinaabe and the Hosanane people, that we would have catering, that we would have, I mean, 20 years ago, I also didn't imagine Zoom, but that's a whole other component of this, but this is a really important thing. So just wanted to let you know about the recording and the accessibility features. Today is featuring lightning presentations, but what are we talking about? We're really here today to talk about innovative approaches to discussing harm reduction and cannabis, particularly around young people. And what we're doing is upending a century of fear and stigma. But I think it's important to contextualize the moment that we're at. And I do that with a sort of a personal reflection on where I've come from in my journey in this area. When I was 16, I began consuming cannabis for medical purposes to deal with the effects of a serious assault that left me with traumatic brain injury, broken bones, PTSD, and nerve damage. And I had no one to talk to about why or how I was consuming cannabis. I felt very alone. I also felt fearful that I was going to be arrested, and my trauma and my pain had to remain my own. The DARE officer at my school several years previous had told me in no uncertain terms that marijuana was just as addictive and deadly as heroin, and the commercials available at that time told me that my brain was going to be scrambled if I consumed cannabis. I had, of course, friends, and they were just as uninformed as I was. They were of no help. They could tell me where to get cannabis, but beyond that, they really didn't know too much. And for example, one time when I didn't have a pipe, I crushed a Coke can, poked some holes in it, and smoked cannabis out of that. And I think back now to the paint and the aluminum and the lining in there, and God, that was stupid. But I had no one to talk to about, hey, like, this is how you can safely consume cannabis without heating up an aluminum Coke can. And I think back on that, one of my dumbest moments of my life, and I contextualize that to where we are now, which I think is so important. Because today, due to the widespread social change and the opportunities created by cannabis legalization, we're here and we can have honest, evidence-informed conversations about what harm reduction is and how we can avoid stigmatizing cannabis consumers or pushing them away from public health practitioners. The research suggests, though, that in order to have these conversations effectively, we need materials that are made by young people and center their voice in these discussions. And it's important that we really acknowledge that I think a lot of these programs today, that's the heart of what we're talking about. The harm reduction may be the title, but really what we're talking about here is the centering of youth voices and the empowerment of voices to ensure that we're not doing a top-down approach. We're not sort of paternalistically telling people what they need to do, but that we're listening and responding to them. There is no doubt, DARE is dead. And today we're going to highlight what the next generation of cannabis education initiatives look like and how we can keep Canadians safer and having safe and enjoyable experiences with cannabis, not by scaring them or admonishing them or lying to them, but by discussing cannabis as it is, a relatively harmless drug that nevertheless does have potential harms. And thankfully, many of those harms are being better understood. And along with that understanding, we can also think about how to mitigate those harms for those people who find themselves in use patterns where those harms are increased. So I'm super excited that we're having this event today. It is really beyond, again, what I imagined and what I thought possible all those many years ago. And I'm really just so excited and thankful for everyone for coming today. So the order of events today is that we're going to start with a short overview of harm reduction presented by Emily Jenkins from UBC. We'll then move into an overview of the TRACE project that Emily and Rebecca have worked on together. I'll then talk briefly about the Weed Out Misinformation campaign, which I have shamelessly plugged on both sides of me here. I could zoom in more with this camera. It's got the capabilities, but I'm very purposely not doing that. And then after that, we are going to have 4 lightning presentations from really amazing groups doing great work here about cannabis in Canada. And then after that, I think comes the highlight of this, is when we're going to have a youth panel discussion about sort of the future of cannabis harm reduction, what they're seeing, what they'd like to be seeing, and really thinking about how that youth voice can be centered more. And then after that, we'll have some question time, some networking time. We're doing all of this in 2 hours. It's ambitious, I know. And in order to hit that target, I'm going to stop talking now. And I'll say, Emily, you're up, and take it away.
Thanks, Daniel. All right. I wanted to start off by saying that I am joining everyone today from the University of British Columbia, where I live and work on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam peoples. I'm thrilled to be coming together today with such an amazing group of people to discuss innovations in harm reduction for youth cannabis use. As we get underway, I wanted to take the opportunity to provide a bit of an orientation to the event and approach taken. Specifically, I want to talk about what we mean by harm reduction, its history, what it is, what it isn't, common misconceptions, and how it relates to youth cannabis use. Once we're on the same page about this, I think we'll be ready to get going with the interesting stuff. So harm reduction at its core is about reducing harms in the context of risks. That's the takeaway. And so while we're talking about youth and cannabis use today, I think it's important to consider some of the other really important or common harm reduction approaches that we utilize in our everyday lives to reduce harms of inherently risky behaviors. Next slide. For example, when driving cars, which is an extremely risky behavior that most of us engage in, we mitigate the risks by imposing rules such as speed limits and the use of seat belts. Next slide. Likewise, for those of us who ride bikes, in many jurisdictions, helmets have become mandatory as an evidence-based public health approach to minimizing the harms associated with this activity. Next slide. And so you can see, most of us are actually on board with harm reduction. Where this paradigm becomes a little more divisive is in the context of substance use, and in particular, youth substance use. However, I'll argue as I move through this part of today's presentation that actually harm reduction for youth should be considered just as obvious a course of action as a seatbelt is to driving. Next slide. Harm reduction in the context of substance use emerged in the late 1980s alongside the rise in HIV infection in Canada. It has continued to evolve and involves a range of strengths-based and health-promoting policies and practices which seek to reduce the adverse health, social, and economic factors that contribute to substance use harms. Harm reduction is based on an understanding that many of the harms of substance use are socially determined, requiring solutions based in social justice. Next slide. One of the great aspects of harm reduction is that it's an inclusive approach that applies across the spectrum of use. Therefore, it's relevant to those who are abstinent, through to those who experience what may be termed problematic substance use or substance dependence. Next slide. In this way, harm reduction is about meeting people where they are at. Next slide. However, I also want to acknowledge that for some people, the term harm reduction leads to feelings of fear, including a concern that harm reduction in some way encourages or promotes substance use. It does not. Central to this orientation is an acknowledgement that there are real and tragic harms and dangers associated with some drug use. It does not encourage or promote drug use. Next slide. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page about what we mean by harm reduction, let's talk about harm reduction in the context of youth substance use. In this domain, harm reduction represents an alternative orientation to substance use education and intervention with the potential to overcome pitfalls or shortfalls of existing programs. Next slide. Many years ago now, Bach and Morales argued that in social contexts in which drug use is positively reinforced by peers and youth endorse positive effects of drug use, abstinence and prevention approaches to substance use are, quote, a form of denial by adults about the actual behaviors of teenagers and young adults. Next slide. Further, there are notable limitations to current approaches to substance use education. School-based approaches to youth substance use have dominated and have consisted largely of didactic approaches that focus on the transmission of knowledge and emphasize the risks of substance use, with young people positioned as passive recipients. These top-down models have been criticized for focusing on individual level behavior and disregarding the context of use. Next slide. Furthermore, it is recognized that information alone does not prevent the initiation of substance use nor alter drug use patterns. Next slide. So what do youth themselves have to say about harm reduction, and that in the context of substance use, cannabis use? That's what we're here to share today. But before I hand things over to my colleagues to speak about some of the research that's been underway among our teams, I want to share a few of the clear messages that we've heard from youth through some of our earlier research. In a study that our team published a few years ago, next slide, we analyzed data from a sample of 83 young people from 3 communities in the province of BC: the city, an urban community; the valley, a suburban community; and the north, a rural community. These communities were distinct in their composition and provided insights into young people's substance use patterns or practices and wisdom. The city is characterized by a more progressive population of higher relative income and education levels. The valley is characterized by a high proportion of religious families and a socially conservative orientation. And the north is a resource-poor community dealing with the historical and current challenges of colonialism, including pronounced health inequities. In each of these communities, youth shared their parents' approaches to substance use, as well as what resonated with them. Next slide. What stood out from this work was that there are very different approaches to substance use that emerged by context. A really important element of this work were the insights that we were able to draw from youth regarding what resonates with them in terms of approaches to substance use. And beyond the differences across contexts, what united all of their stories was the message that both unrestricted leniency or zero tolerance approaches are unhelpful. Rather, youth want open discussion, trust, and connection. In essence, harm reduction approaches were the most responsive to youth substance use perspectives and needs. Next slide. On this note, I want to summarize that there is strong evidence emerging in support of innovations in harm reduction for youth cannabis use. And importantly, if we believe that at the heart of harm reduction is the goal of reducing harms in the context of risk, then it is about so much more than simply substance use focused intervention. In fact, the most effective substance use intervention likely has little to do with substance use itself, but rather creating conditions in which youth feel valued, respected, and connected. To me, this seems as obvious a course of action as a seatbelt is to driving. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Rebecca, who's going to share some of the history of our youth engaged cannabis and harm reduction research program, the Teens Report on Adolescent Cannabis Experiences Studies.
Thank you, Emily. It's actually Anna Figuera who'll be presenting today because I am sick at home with COVID. So take it away, Anna Figueras, the excellent project coordinator for the TRACE project with me here at Calgary.
All right. Okay. Thank you for that. Yes, I was just going to say that Rebecca's feeling a little bit under the weather, so I am stepping in. So hello, everyone. I am here to talk to you about TRACE, and this program is actually funded by the CIHR. The main investigators in this project are Emily Jenkins as well as Rebecca Saw. And so far, there have been 4 projects undertaken by the research team, building over a decade of research. The research itself seeks to engage youth to understand their experiences and to develop cannabis education resources. So TRACE stands for, as you can see on the left, Teens Report on Adolescent Cannabis Experiences. The first TRACE, it was primary data collection. The second one, it consisted on knowledge translation projects. And there was a creation of a brochure called Teens Public Health Messages about Cannabis. On the third TRACE, there was a creation of a film-based resource called Cycles, which was designed to pretty much support dialogue in classroom settings on the topic of decision-making related to cannabis use. That leads us to TRACE 4, which took place between 2016 and 2018. And in this project, it sought to understand how parents who have used cannabis and or who use cannabis address the cannabis conversation with their children. And of course, due to the timing, this is in the context of legal change. In addition, the study identified the gaps in resources available for parents. So at the end, when it came to the findings, TRACE 4 suggested that we need to create supports for adults that enable clear and credible communication about the known risks of cannabis use, and also that we need to challenge our assumptions that parents are abstinents or that they hide their use in the family context. And this leads us to TRACE 5, which is the current version that we are working in right now. In terms of status, we have completed data collection and we are right now moving on to data analysis. So you may be wondering, what led to this study? So we know that cannabis education uses a very universal approach that conceptualizes all cannabis use by youth as the same, as very equal. However, our youth engaged research indicates that these approaches do not necessarily resonate with many youth because it neglects the culture as well as the context that shapes cannabis use. Also, we know that problematic use of substances can be higher among groups experiencing structural inequities. And we know that these specific groups are quite often left out of the conversations about cannabis education. So what is the goal of the study? We are identifying how youth outside the mainstream perceive the potential risks of using cannabis, and also to include youth as co-developers of harm reduction messages. And in the study itself, we interview 56 youth online from all across Canada, and we also conducted 4 focus groups as a way to member check the things we initially heard from the interviews. So who did we interview? Most people that we interview were from Alberta, but we also spoke to people from BC, Ontario, Quebec, as well as Manitoba. Almost half of the participants identified as women, but we also interviewed people who identified as men, non-binary, transgender, non-conforming, as well as genderqueer. About a third of the sample identified as heterosexual, but the majority, about 62%, identified as LGBTQ+. Also, a third of the sample identified as white, but we had a wide range of ethno-racial backgrounds. In terms of financial circumstances, almost half of participants said that they were able to meet their basic expenses with a little money left over. And also, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, we asked our participants how often they use cannabis, and 76% said at least once a week. So let's talk about some preliminary themes. So we found that participants use cannabis as a strategy to support mental health and facilitate self-functionality. Also, when we spoke about health and social inequities and those experiences, they are based on various intersecting identities, and that can influence cannabis use. In terms of stigma, experiences with cannabis stigma can be experienced in different spheres, and there was an emphasis in experiencing stigma in primary care as well as mental health care. There were also conversations about inaccessibility of resources that are based on affordability, a lack of affordability and availability. Also, youth reported that they do engage in harm reduction strategies. And today I am going to present some data from the interviews as well as the focus groups on stigma and harm reduction. So let's talk about stigma. This is a quote from one of our interviews where the participant speaks about feeling shame as well as judgment from their family members. So in our focus groups, we pose the question, okay, so how does stigma and discrimination look like for young adults who use cannabis? And this is what they have to say. Here we have some examples. And they also share that individuals or groups with intersecting identities experience more stigma for using cannabis than their counterparts. And then when it came to harm reduction, here is an example from one of our interviews as to a person who told us that before they go to class or before they go to work, they wouldn't smoke cannabis. So we see that there is a self-awareness as to these strategies that they use to engage in harm reduction. So we pose this question in our focus groups. Oh, could we identify some ways in which youth engages in harm reduction strategies? And here they have a lot to say. We just put some together for you today. But harm reduction strategies were based on health concerns, and a lot of the conversations were centered on staying in control, as well as being responsible about use. And also, as we can see from this example, there is a need for cannabis education that is evidence-based as well as youth-friendly. Okay, so I will not take any more of the time, but the main takeaway from the latest iteration of TRACE 5, is that currently in the post-legalization context, Canadian youth are using cannabis as a tool for wellness and also for self-medication and to address and they're doing this to address mental illness symptoms. And also they're encountering institutional and structural barriers when accessing treatment. Thank you so much. And I will be passing it on to Dr. Daniel Bear.
Okay, Zoom keeps muting me, so maybe it doesn't like me or something. Thanks, Anna. And you can go over to the next slide there. So we're gonna be talking about the Weed Out Misinformation campaign. And I wanna just introduce the team and acknowledge all the hard work. We just hired our 25th research assistant on this project. And we're doing a project about centering youth voices, and they really have carried this project throughout. The 3 faculty members, Ashley, Marilyn, and myself, have all been very involved, but it's really the research assistants that have carried it. And I just want to acknowledge their hard work. Next slide, please. Our partners on this project have been Canadian Students for Sensible Drugs Policy, who again helped ensure that we centered youth voices throughout this project, the Canadian Public Health Association, and our funding has come through an NSERC Colleges and Community Social Innovation Fund grant. Next slide. So this project has had 3 phases. We wanted to gather data. We did that through surveys and focus groups with young people. We then took that data to students in the Bachelor of Creative Advertising program here at Humber and asked them to take the analysis that we conducted and actually turn that into campaign ideas. We then took those campaign ideas back to cannabis consumers, to bud tenders, and to public health experts. And we worked through all of the issues to come up with the Weed Out Misinformation campaign. We're currently getting ready to launch our evaluation. I know it says October 2022, but this is academics work, so we're like 6 months behind that easily, but that's fine. Next slide. So with our survey, we wanted to understand some key things. We wanted to get your basics about how they're consuming cannabis, but we also wanted to know who people trusted and what knowledge levels they had about cannabis, and also what sources they wanted to go to. Because we realized that there's been a lot of good work on youth harm reduction around cannabis and other drugs, but part of it is we wanted to start targeting it into potentially new channels where such information has not previously been delivered. So you can take it into the next slide, please, Anna. And one of the things we identified was that young people were going to places and individuals for information who they did not have a lot of trust in the information that they were getting from, but were not going to places where they did have trust about the information that was present. So we wanted to make sure that we developed our materials not only with a youth voice, but targeted where those voices were telling us to put the materials where they trusted that information to come from. So you notice here, academic research has very high levels of trust, but also very low levels of engagement, whereas friends, not surprisingly, very high levels of engagement, a fair amount of trust, but also some issues that come up with, well, what do your friends actually know and what can they actually tell you? We identified that in the qualitative research. Next slide, please, Anna. And in our focus groups, we came up with some important themes. We saw that participants were concerned about cannabis. They enjoyed consuming cannabis, but they also acknowledged it might potentially have some harms, and they wanted to understand how to respond to those harms. They also wanted to consume cannabis in a way that fit with their goals. Not everybody wants to get high for the same reason or get to the same amount of high or get high in the same ways. And so ensuring that we understood that our materials acknowledge the variety of experiences for young people was really important to us. We also, as has been found many other times, identified that young people felt incredibly stigmatized by the information that was out there. And I remember one young woman talking about how getting on the subway right after she had smoked a joint was one of the worst experiences for her while high, not because anything bad happened on the subway, but because she could tell that other people were looking at her and could smell the cannabis on her. And she felt incredibly stigmatized during that experience and just felt like this nice, relaxing, enjoyable experience that she was having had turned quite quickly. We also identified, not surprisingly, people wanted positive messages and that they wanted key players in their cannabis experience to be better informed. This included bud tenders, parents, physicians, many people who they were interacting with, but who they felt did not actually understand what it is they were consuming or why they were consuming. Next slide, please, Anna. Oh, that's a blank slide. Let's just move right past that one. Oh, there we go. I forgot to put an animation on that. Generally, I don't do that. So we created the Weed Out Misinformation campaign. I say we, but again, it really was the research assistants and the students in the Bachelor of Creative Advertising and our focus group participants who really created this, came up with the name, came up with the imagery. I mean, I was there to make sure that the stuff there was scientifically accurate, but beyond that, we really let it go and be led and directed by the young people. I've got several of my RAs in the room with me here who are nodding their heads, all agreeing. So. And I hope they're doing that out of genuine belief in that. We can go on to the next slide here. So we created what we called our archetypes. And these were different individuals who were supposed to represent different types of cannabis consumers. And we had a variety that included every kind of ethnicity background. We can go on to the next slide. We had all different gender identities in there. We made sure that people experienced, there should be one, maybe I put a bunch of duplicates in there. Oh, there we go, perfect. So you can see here, this was not the final draft, but these archetypes were in line with what our data identified as key individuals who were trusted by the community. And so each character or archetype here has a history, has a background, has a profession or a role in society that comes through in the variety of materials when you engage on the website or the various posters in there. We can move through to the next slide. And we created the Weed Out Misinformation website, which is getting some pretty good hits there, and is currently in an evaluation phase. You can go to the next slide as well. And when we created the website, one of the things that we wanted to ensure was that there was also physical materials for in-store engagement, because we identified that bud tenders were an important resource, but weren't particularly trusted. And so working with bud tenders and young people, we created handouts. On the left, you can see a bag stuffer. I think about 10,000 of those went out in retail stores across Canada. And then we also have our cannabis consumption for bud beginners and weed whizzes, 2 different pamphlets that are available in some stores, and we're hoping to expand that as well, because we realized that the retail engagement was a side where harm reduction was not being discussed with young people, but an overwhelming percentage of people are now getting their cannabis from legal sources. And so it's important that that avenue, even if bud tenders are limited by law in terms of what they can talk about, we've got a bit of room here where we can provide information and takeaways for people when they're actually in the store. And the next slide, please. And one of the other things that we did, which I think is really important here, is we started talking about set and setting. Harm reduction is often considered in the case of cannabis around respiratory issues and mental health, but it's also important that people understand how and why they're making decisions around their cannabis consumption. And so set and setting is a classic idea in any drugs consumption discussion, and ensuring that you understand where you are here and where you are physically to make a good choice about how you're going to consume cannabis, and if you're in a safe space to consume cannabis. And this was something that had not been focused on a lot, but I think it's a foundational element. If you understand what is a good situation for you individually to consume cannabis, what works for you, for your set and setting, and where you're at, that's quite important. There we go. And next slide, please. And so these are some of our archetypes, and I just wanted to introduce you to some of them. The woman on the left in the green shirt, if I remember correctly, she's a barista. The woman in the back with purple hair is a cannabis influencer. The young man in the front there uses cannabis for medical purposes. The young man in the back enjoys gaming. The woman in the blue dress is a teacher. And the woman in the back right with the purple is everybody's favorite aunt. And these are all individuals that were identified as being important in people's lives and wanting to be able to engage with. And so we built these characters around there. So that's all from me and the Weed Out Misinformation campaign. We're going to move now into the lightning presentations from the 4 other groups that have participating today. And so first up with that, we have Kia Ellis Durity and Scott St. Marie from Cannabis and Mental Health.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and everyone for joining. We don't have a lot of time for each of our slides. I know my name says Kia, but I'm Scott St. Marie. Daniel, straight up respect and for the vulnerability and of you sharing your journey in like 3 minutes. Think about how many stories Daniel would have to share about that recovery and what he went through, and what a positive outcome and the difference you've made in everyone here. And I think of that with this project that we've had with cannabis and mental health. We started this about 5 years ago when it was cannabis and psychosis. That was our job, to see and explore the link between cannabis use and psychosis, and what questions youth had, and is there a link, and is there a perfect causation, and what do we know, what don't we know? And we wanted to make it way more broad than that, to reach more people, to answer youth questions. Sorry, the next slide, we just went back one. So we created a online course called cannabisandmentalhealth.ca. This is a course made by youth across the entire country, over 30 youth involved, with male, female, non-binary perspectives, indigenous perspectives and experiences. And we created 2 things, okay? We created an online course, which is a 90-minute harm reduction course about cannabis. The more I know about cannabis, the more I don't know. It's so complicated. It helped, well, just for example, again, Daniel so much. I haven't used cannabis in 5 years because I've always gotten panic attacks, and it doesn't matter how little, how much, it just doesn't work for me. So the course and what we've done is it's so individualistic, and we give youth all the tools from youth perspective about harm reduction, how to use it safely. Here's what you can know about setting, dosage, strains, etc. So we made that for youth, which is a certificate course, and you get a LinkedIn badge and a certificate. And then we made a mentor guide. And a mentor guide, we'll go in detail, Kia will, is for parents, for educators, for youth allies who want to work, who do work with youth and want to share some tools and games to get the discussion going around cannabis and mental health and emotional well-being. So those are the 2 products that we have under the brand of Cannabis and Mental Health, and some awesome partners under the Schizophrenia Society of Canada, Mental Health Commission, Youth Rex. It's been a heck of a couple of years. So next slide. And this is, again, just the mentor guide for teachers and youth allies and for youth. These are just a few of the themes. So obviously youth-led across youth across Canada, obviously a harm reduction approach, Indigenous perspectives, and really focusing on lived experience of youth who hadn't used cannabis at all, but what questions did they have? What experience did they have being surrounded by people who did use cannabis, right? What goes on in the mind of youth when is there a feeling of being left out, the willingness to try, peer pressure, centering around lived experience of youth who used it for anxiety, for depression, for pain, for all types of mood disorders, mental illness, or everything under that umbrella. So the course and mentor guide, here's kind of the framework you can see here. Next slide. And I'll let Kia take over from here.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so I'll briefly go over what is in the course. So the course is a 4-module course. With module 1, we go over the basics. We provide folks with the facts around like what is mental health and what is substance use health. And then in mod 2, we explore the link. So we dive deeper into what cannabis use is and means to people and the link between cannabis and mental health. And then in mod 3, we go into the legal and social issues. So we provide young folks with more of the historical context, the war on drugs, why Canada decided to legalize in 2018, and the current context that we're in today. And then in mod 4, we put it into practice. So here we have different tools. We have a meditation video that one of our Youth Action Committee members created, and just different ways of reducing harms for your individual person. And then we have extra resources where people can explore Cannabis Corner. There's a video where people can understand cannabis packaging, because that can be really convoluted and is a barrier for harm reduction. And then there's also Mindbox, so more mental health and mental wellness tools. Next slide, please. And then just to explain more of the mentor guide. So we have different themes here. There's 6 themes that, as we mentioned, like youth allies, youth workers, parents, guardians can explore. So we have balance and change, identity and influences, helping yourself and others, problem solving, harm reduction and stigma, and stress and resilience. And as you explore the website, we can link it in the chat later on. There's all these different types of activities. So there's videos that folks can watch together, and then there's reflection questions as well. There's songs, stories, and poems, deep thoughts, and then we also have worksheets that people can work on together. And then we have more physical activities where there's like yoga for people to de-stress, and just activities interacting with the physical world. And we found that this is a really helpful resource if people are trying to facilitate either the course or they just want to talk about certain topics around cannabis and mental health, virtually or in person. And next slide. And so we don't want to take up too much time here, but I will be in the youth panel. So if people have any more questions around the Cannabis and Mental Health Project and how it was formed and what our process was, I'll be there. But we encourage people to take the course. We're always accepting feedback, and please visit the mentor guide because it can be really fun. There's a lot of activities there, and follow us and share as always. Like I said, we'll link to the website in the chat later on. And thank you. Thanks for letting us share.
Thank you, Kia and Scott, for that presentation there. And moving right along, these are lightning presentations, and that was a perfect example of it. Quite a lot covered very quickly, so thank you for that. Our next project that we're going to be talking about is Cannabis in Our Communities, a focus on Inuit youth, from Chelsea Giesel.
Thank you. Yep, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So good afternoon, Ulukut. As Daniel mentioned, my name is Chelsea, and it's my pleasure to present the Let's Talk About Uyarak toolkit on behalf of Pauktuti Inuit Women of Canada. And I myself am of settler ancestry, and I acknowledge the land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe that I'm joining from in what is also known as Ottawa. And this land is also now home to the largest population of Inuit outside of the Inuit homeland, Inuit Nunangat. So in case you don't know, Pauktuti is the national organization that represents the interests of Inuit women and families across Canada. So when cannabis was legalized in 2018, our board of Inuit women directors expressed legitimate concern about how this might impact the communities, especially youth. So we began the Cannabis in Our Communities project, which is the first Inuit organization-led research and awareness project by engaging with communities across Inuit Nunangat, a similar model to what Daniel was describing in his presentation. And we wanted to explore how youth and parents perceived cannabis, what they believe about it, what do they think the risks are, with the goal to actually use this information to benefit communities. So that's how the Let's Talk About Uyarak toolkit came about, which is, it's a community care toolkit or harm reduction toolkit that was developed from the lessons and the knowledge gaps and priorities that youth and parents identified during these engagements. Next slide, please. So during these engagements, youth and parents expressed that cannabis education is definitely needed in Inuit communities, but more so it should be targeted at youth. It should be specific to Inuit, informed by Inuit culture, and delivered in safe spaces. And we at Pauktuti obviously agree. So we responded to this need, the needs identified by youth and parents through the development of this toolkit. And uyarak is the Inuktitut word for stone. So in the context of cannabis use, it's kind of slang for being stoned. And this name kind of arose because Inuit experienced that while cannabis is commonly used, it's rarely talked about with regard to safety or safe use. So let's talk about uyarak, let's talk about cannabis. Next slide, please. So while harm reduction is gaining in understanding and practice in the South, it is still quite a foreign term among Inuit, which is why we kind of refer to it as a community care toolkit. However, a lot of the principles of harm reduction, like the ones you can see in this slide, like being open and inclusive, being respectful, being centered around people and safety, these are also core principles of Inuit Kauyumayatuqangit, or that which Inuit have always known. So it's their knowledge system, their traditional knowledge. So while Inuit may not commonly use the term harm reduction, it is already fundamentally part of their knowledge system. And Western culture and social work is finally kind of catching up to what Indigenous and Inuit have been teaching for centuries. So combining the strategy of Western harm reduction while framing it through the Inuit lens was kind of our approach to the harm reduction toolkit for Inuit youth to make it resonate and make it relatable. Next slide. Thank you. So on the screen is a little bit of what the toolkit includes, and it addresses the diverse needs of youth by looking at cannabis use holistically, which again is a principle of harm reduction. But this also includes the layered reasons why youth might use cannabis or develop problematic cannabis use. And as the representative organization for Inuit women and families, Pauktuti focuses much more widely on social barriers and inequities, and we advocate for improvement in housing, employment, food security, access to healthcare and recreation, which are all factors that that can impact cannabis use by Inuit youth. Inuit youth in remote communities also have different access to internet, which is something we take for granted in the South, but it's few and far between in the North. And so we wanted to make the toolkit accessible in ways that are not only on the internet. While social media is still a huge factor and is largely used, we wanted to make it accessible in other places. So the traditional radio is still huge in the North, physical toolkits in schools and health centers, and posters and imagery in communities is still a big way to kind of reach that target population. And given that there's many dialects spoken across the North, we've also tailored the toolkit to youth by translating it into 5 different dialects of Inuktitut for use across the North. Next slide, please. Thank you. So youth were really central in this project as they identified the needs, their perceptions, their behaviors around cannabis, and some of the challenges that they see with regard to cannabis education specific for Inuit. And their role as kind of sharers in discussion groups really helped us identify these priorities that should be a part of cannabis education, like being Inuit-led, reflecting Inuit realities, Inuit imagery, and how we're going to share the toolkit. The youth also played a central role in an advisory committee that kind of guides this entire project. So all activities and all key messages are developed with the committee and also reviewed by the committee afterwards before anything's kind of published. And we had additional youth reviewers that were central in kind of fine-tuning the strength-based and Inuit-led messaging about safer cannabis use, like some of the messaging you can see here. So we really wanted to take, of course, the harm reduction approach of presenting information, making sure that Inuit youth are informed about the risks so that they can make their own decisions. So now in the last phase of our project, we are re-engaging with youth and communities to see what, if any, impact the toolkit has had. And we look forward to sharing results when they're available. And I wanted to thank our Inuit partners and youth that were involved in creating this toolkit, our funder, Health Canada. And please do take a look at the toolkit at letstalkaboutuyavak.com. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Chelsea. A really interesting project there, and especially highlighting the intersectional issues, complicating the response and the need to really develop materials with such a fine-tuned lens to them. So thank you so much for presenting that, and another great presentation. Next up, we have Heath Alessio from Canadian Students for Sensible Drugs Policy. And while I greatly enjoy all of these projects, I do want to just reiterate again the particular help and support that I found during our project's work with CSSDP and the road that was paved by their Get Sensible toolkit that was put out there. So thank you, Heath, and the floor is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for including us in the work that you did on the Weed Out the Misinformation campaign. It was really nice to kind of be able to collaborate in that way. So that being said, I'll jump into it. You can go to the next slide. It's just like our more branded title slide. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about the Get Sensible campaign, aligning with Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy's mandate to support drug education efforts and building upon youth consultations that we held prior to legalization to address the needs and gaps that young people saw coming out of legalization. Get Sensible came about funded by Health Canada's SUOP funding, to kind of respond to the calls from young people for the development and dissemination of realistic and evidence-based education for young people and by young people. And so you can go to the next slide where I'll introduce myself. My name is Heath, and I am part of a much larger team of entirely young people who you can get only a little bit of a taste of some of them in our slide here. And at its core, what Get Sensible is a community of young people of different backgrounds, experiences, and identities. And that's something that we definitely don't shy away from. And in fact, make a lot of space for talking about, you know, some of us are trans or queer, some of us are Black and Indigenous, some of us are disabled or neurodivergent. And we see all of that as huge assets that create like a well-rounded perspective for the work that we do and an extension of our emphasis on lived experience because of how that shapes our relationships to cannabis, for example. And that being said, the mandate that we have, some of our key kind of pillars of our campaign are being entirely youth-led and doing mainly peer-to-peer outreach. So everybody on our team is under 30, from the grant writing to the graphic design, to the web development, to the creation of our content and our materials. Everything is done entirely by and for young people. And we employ a lot of peer-to-peer strategies, which are very scientifically favored in terms of what is effective education. Young people just get along with each other really well. And so, that's kind of emphasizing one of the other pieces of our work is that it's entirely rooted in evidence-based strategies and info, very much aligning with all of the stuff that Emily was talking about earlier, as well as being centered around harm reduction and lived experience. So moving away from abstinence-only education that is fear-mongering and judgmental and shameful towards more realistic harm reduction models that are compassionate and promote connection and community for young people. And then the last thing is our commitment to accessibility and intersectionality in the work that we do. And like the accessibility piece, I think I'll get into as we move forward, recognizing how many of us are neurodiverse and how different we all are. Like we want materials that are for us. So it makes it a little bit easier. So you can go to the next slide. And when I talk about our materials, one of the main product outputs that we've had this year is our Sensible Cannabis Education Booklet series, which is a 3-part series of booklets with like a very fun, refreshing kind of design. I have some of them here. I mean, you can see the outside. They're available on our website for digital download, and then we can send physical copies out as well. They make really great like little coffee table reads. and there are three kind of focused specific ones, breaking down like our original much bigger, more academic style toolkit to make it a bit more engaging. The first one is Cannabis 101 and harm reduction. So that's like the cannabis basics, the kind of Cannabis 101 science, as well as tangible harm reduction information that young people who consume cannabis or may consume cannabis should know. And that one is targeted more directly at young people. And then Cannabis in Context is one that is looking at the broader context around cannabis, that looks at the historical context, the legislative context, and socio-political contexts, because we do believe that effective education should go beyond the health effects and look at all the other factors that affect drugs and what they mean for us in our societies and in our communities. And that's one that is kind of for everybody. It's really good to sit down, like parents and kids can sit down together and read it and explore and learn together. And then the last one, the Guiding Principles of Education, is our resource that's more specifically tailored to youth allies and the people who support us. So our parents or our teachers, to give them the tools to approach cannabis conversations more confidently with young people. And then you can go to the next slide. One of the other things that we've done is that we made a collection of tearaway resources in a variety of different mediums to kind of pull highlights out, like the most tangible harm reduction messages that like we didn't think maybe young people would have to read a whole book to find. So some of those include, you know, like what to do if someone's greening out and how to recognize like what greening out is, which is often just an overconsumption of cannabis, but it also how to recognize if it is greening out or if maybe it's alcohol poisoning or an overdose, and what to do if that is the case as well as like how to read a cannabis label, information about understanding edibles and how they work, and then one that's like a zine of stoner affirmations, which is essentially, you know, stoner self-care, like how and why you should clean your smoking devices, and why even if you smoke weed, you still deserve to take care of yourself, even if you're smoking weed, which is one of the more stigmatized ways that people can consume cannabis over like edibles or ingestibles. And so the safer smoking one has been pretty interesting for us because it's sometimes controversial, but that's what harm reduction is really about. And then you can go to the next one. We also explore some things like cannabis in the media and just other things that might be of relevant and like interesting for young people. And despite the pandemic and the lockdowns, we were able to do a handful of like outreach and in person with young people, where we collaborated with local CSSTP chapters and would do little pop-ups on university campuses and then throw after parties in the places where young people often consume cannabis. And in harm reduction, we talk about meeting people where they're at. And so we really took that a step further by doing pop-ups at skate parks and at the beach and in parks to really meet young people where they were at and find them, to give them harm reduction information, mobilize our resources and safer smoking supplies and things like that. And then you can go to the next slide. But also recognizing, you know, the limitations of in-person engagement over the past 2 years, as many have. We did pivot to online, but we saw something of an opportunity in that challenge, in that young people spend a lot of time online. And as a campaign that's by and for young people, we all spend a lot of time online. So we kind of know the language of like memes and hashtags that young people are already using. And we see the cannabis trends whenever they come up on social media. And so through that, we've actually been able to reach like over 4 million young people with our harm reduction messages. And it's interesting because one of the biggest ones we had was alternatives to smoking out of a tin can or an aluminum can. Because Dan, you'd mentioned that was something that, you know, was prevalent in your in your youth. And it's something that young people today are still doing. All the young people were tagging their friends that smoke out of cans and being like, hey, don't. So it seemed kind of effective. I don't know. And then you can continue. We've got our Instagram. We're on TikTok, Twitter, YouTube. YouTube is one where we have a series of interviews that we shot with some experts and young people, like putting their perspectives together to really connect research to lived experience through like narrative storytelling. So we're really encouraging people to check those out. I can link them in the chat after. But you can go to the next slide. Because that's like one of the main things that was the goal of our campaign, which was to create conversations. And we've been able to do that through workshops, through roundtable discussions, through the CSSTP podcast that we collaborate with, on our Discord server as well. And so, yeah, we've been really successful in just creating safe spaces for cannabis conversations for young people to happen, that are led by young people, that address the things that are important to us, and make us feel connected and in community rather than kind of outcasted or ostracized and ashamed of our lives and the ways that we cope and exercise our resilience when it comes to mental health, when it comes to just societal challenges as well as young people who use drugs. So yeah, that's it. I think the last slide is just like the website and my email address. So yeah, that's it for us. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Heath, for that. That was a great presentation. Although I am sad to hear that the Coke can is still a popular form of consumption route, but we'll get there eventually. I don't know, maybe we just have to ban Coca-Cola. I don't know. Prohibition doesn't work, so we'll figure something out. Our last lightning presentation here is from Steve Keller from the YMCA's Youth Cannabis Awareness Program. So take it away, Steve.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Keller, presenting to you from Peterborough, Ontario, upon territory of the Mississauga, Anishinaabe, and adjacent to the Haudenosaunee territory. And I am here to speak today a little bit about the YCAP program, or the Youth Cannabis Awareness Program, which is a nationally offered presentation or series of presentations funded through Health Canada's Substance Use and Addiction Program funding. We offer free presentations for youth ages 12 to 24, which I'll get into a little bit in a moment. And before I get into those, what I would like to talk about is a little bit about our vision and our approach to discussing cannabis. So on the next slide, we sort of have three approaches that we often cover through YCAP. And the first one that we discuss is that we are cannabis neutral. And so much of the discussion that we've heard today really speaks to this importance of neutrality. We understand that fear mongering and negative based messaging is not only ineffective, but in a lot of ways, it simply just creates more stigma and more sort of misconception about cannabis. Would you be able to jump ahead to the next slide there for me? Fantastic. So that importance of neutrality really comes into play in terms of our program. From there, we do promote the idea of a balanced perspective in understanding that part of our mandate is to discuss the potential risks of adolescent cannabis use, signs of risky or harmful behavior or dependent behavior, shall we say. But most importantly, we also discuss things like harm reduction. But even going back to that idea of balance, not only do we discuss risks, but we also discuss the uses. It's important for youth, for young adults, for professionals that work with youth, not just to understand that there are risks of cannabis. Sure, and we talk about those. But they need to understand the reasons that someone may choose to use cannabis, or understand the methods of consumption, or understand a little bit of the history of the industrial side of the plant, the economic side of the product, the medicinal uses. So we do like to sort of focus on both sides. I often say that we're not trying to sway our audience's opinion, we're simply trying to inform it. And that brings me to the third pillar of our program, which is harm reduction. Daniel, you mentioned quite astutely that we know that the Just Say No sort of campaign doesn't work. I've often joked in the past, if Just Say No had worked, why do we have beer stores and LCBOs? So we do understand that harm reduction is not only relevant, but it's extremely important and something that youth do all the time. So this is something that we try to put more normalized into the conversation so that they're aware that they do practice harm reduction. And when it comes to cannabis use, there are some strategies they're already aware of that they may not recognize are reducing harms or risks. But not only that, we try to prepare them with additional skills if they haven't thought of them before. So on the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about what programs do we offer. I said we offer a series of different workshops and presentation options. So on the very next slide, I kind of have our top four that are geared specifically for youth. The first is actually a sort of a trivia game I just did for a Youth Job Connect program this morning for about 25 people. What it is we call it Canifacts. We explore sort of common phrases, topics, or ideas that youth, that parents, that professionals bring up about cannabis. And we try to either debunk the ones that are myths, clarify any of them that are misconceptions, or explain why certain ones are really based in fact. It discusses a great deal of sort of the evidence basis of our program and where the evidence comes into sort of these ideas to create more of a clear understanding. The second workshop that we offer is called Let's Talk About Cannabis. This is a workshop designed to be a discussion between presenter and youth to really sort of unpack the differences of different methods of consumption. Because it's not really enough anymore to talk about just the specific information about cannabis in and of itself. Because 30 years ago, that conversation was discussing things like smoking joints, smoking pipes, makeshift bongs, as we've heard a couple times today, or maybe edibles. We've seen the market evolve quite a bit in the last 20 or 30 years. We now see topical creams, we see beverages, we see dabs, we see concentrates, we see vapes and e-liquids. So really discussing and understanding each method of consumption and how they can affect the body differently become all the more important. The third workshop that we offer for youth, Cannabis in the Adolescent Brain, really tries to unpack that discussion that we've tried to have over the last few years about why is it that health agencies and healthcare providers recommend that individuals wait or limit their use until the age of 25. When we ask youth this question, they say, well, it has something to do with the brain. And we say, okay, what does it have to do with the brain? And there's a long silence on the other end. So in this presentation, we try to discuss as much as we can about what's going on with the brain during adolescent development and what has current and emerging research been showing about the impacts of particularly THC, but cannabis in general, have on the development of the brain, or sort of the impact of cannabis use on the certain neurotransmitters that are passed along through the brain. The fourth workshop that we offer specifically for colleges and universities, as well as professionals working with youth, is a data mine of a presentation. Some of you have perhaps seen it before, called Youth and Cannabis Use, a Canadian Landscape. Here we sort of identify the emerging patterns and trends we've seen in multiple national surveys conducted between about 2017 up to this past spring, and sort of look at what are we seeing in the behaviors, not just of youth that are using, but of all ages, to see are there differences, are there similarities, and how can we sort of identify positive examples for our older audiences to be able to set for younger people, or for the younger audiences to really understand when they're having discussions about cannabis with each other. On the next slide, though, this is really what we want to talk about today. It's not just what does YCAP do, it's how do we get youth involved. YCAP has long focused on the importance of involving youth, and this is a pillar of the why, but of our program specifically. So to this end, we sort of have four major ways that our program incorporates the voice of youth, and we do this on a regular basis. So on the next slide, we see that the first way is that we promote what we call a youth engagement project. Here, our staff and our team are able to actually work with groups of youth all across Canada to create some form of an awareness raising piece about cannabis. It could be discussing general knowledge or awareness, clarifying misconceptions, identifying potential risks or harm reduction strategies, or even helping other youth connect with referral agencies. The youth that we work with, our role is to simply provide them with the information so that they can then choose what form do they want to create. Would it be a podcast? Would it be a video? Would it be in printed apparel? Would it be a poster? Would it be a fact sheet? They get to choose what content they want to focus on, and they get to identify which audience or audiences would they like to showcase their projects for. Similarly, we actually offer an annual contest, which is called a Youth for Youth Digital Media Contest, whereby Canadian young adults between the ages of 18 to 24 are invited to develop a short educational video or poster to raise awareness about the impacts of cannabis use on adolescent brain development. I see that we're a little over time, so I want to get to these last couple. The third one is that we offer placement opportunities, and I love that I'm presenting with Humber today because I actually have 5 Humber students conducting placements with us right now, doing things like co-facilitation, joining on meetings. And the fourth thing is our Youth Advisory Council. And I'd like to end off on this because we're about to segue over into youth discussion. This is where we directly meet with a group of youth across Canada to get their interpretations, their responses, and their views towards cannabis to help us inform our own content. And the very last slide is simply just to say thank you all very much. We certainly hope that you enjoyed the quick discussion. And if you have any questions, you can email us at any time or visit our website, for which I have provided the information in the chat panel. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Steve. And with that, that ends our lightning presentations. And so we're going to take just a 5-minute break. So it is currently 1:15. How perfect. So we will be back at 1:20. So get up, grab a drink. We're going to set up for our youth discussion panel to follow shortly. Thank you so much, everybody, for your presentations, and we'll see you in a couple minutes. All right, everybody, welcome back for the second part of our presentation today. We're going to be having a discussion with youth leaders around cannabis issues. We've called it What's Next? Hearing from Youth Experts. And to lead that discussion will be Anna. And so Anna, take it away.
Hello there. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here today, and thank you so much to all our speakers for those amazing presentations. Okay, so we are going to right now, as I am speaking, I'm going to put the spotlight also on our excellent youth panel. So give me 1 second to set this up. Okay. 1 second, everyone. I'm very sorry for this. It seems that I cannot put Scott in the spotlight for some reason. Rebecca, if you're able to hear this, if you can help me put the spotlight on Scott, that will be great.
Okay, I'm not aware of that, but I'll see what I can do.
Okay,
I think we should just begin in the meantime.
for sure. Okay, so with our youth expert panel, we will be discussing about implementation of harm reduction approaches in our research as well in our programs. And also how, in a way, we can engage in continuous improvement, right? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And how can we keep these projects as well as research youth-centered, right? So I would like to take this moment to introduce our youth expert panel. From Cannabis and Mental Health, we have Kia as well as Scott. We also joining us are Danica, Alex, and Emma. All right, so they all have, they all have very different experiences with cannabis use, and as well as very different levels of advocacy and involvement in cannabis education programs, okay? So for our attendees, I just want to remind you that you can ask any questions at any point using the Q&A function, and you will be able to see it right down below. It looks just like the chat button, but it literally just has Q&A in it. So feel free to post any questions using that, okay? All right, so why don't we start? Dear panel, thank you for being here today. We want to know in terms of, maybe we could start by, what are your thoughts on the presentations that you just saw and all this research as well as programs that are focused on cannabis education from a harm reduction approach that target youth?
I can start briefly. Yeah, I would say like it's inspiring and affirming to have like so many different projects focusing on harm reduction, especially with the focus on young people, and just seeing like the diverse age range that these projects are engaging young people at. It's really, really inspiring, but also keeping in mind that a lot of these projects are on a grant basis, and for a majority of cannabis projects that I'm aware of, there is like an end date to that. So understanding that harm reduction doesn't end 3 or 4 years post legalization, that like education is ongoing. Like right now is the legislative review, so things also could be changing. So just keeping in mind that there's always a need for cannabis education projects, mental health projects. But it's amazing to see. It's amazing to see what people are doing right now.
Yeah, kind of as Kia said, it's really cool to see all the work that's being done, especially regarding youth and cannabis use. And yeah, I just think it's really inspiring. And yeah, that's all I can think of right now. But
It's cool to see it all, and it feels like it's a good comeuppance time for it. But it also feels like it should just be kind of like the tip where it's like, feels like we're just starting to get it and actually put that down in like meaningful ways. So I want to see more in continuation past grant dates, etc.
It really feels like the dawning of an age of inclusivity as far as cannabis in the world goes. Canada really starting off, getting the ball rolling for a lot of other nations, and we're just seeing like what we can do to help the people who are still underage, not legally able to purchase cannabis, but still knowing that they use them. It's nice to see that there's advocacy towards people to use it in healthy ways, as well as just to help themselves. So keep up the great work, everybody. It's looking phenomenal.
Definitely. And I guess the itching question that everyone who's watching right now is like the first question that we have up right now. We are just dying to ask youth, what does the future of youth focused harm reduction for cannabis research? And right now, we're not only talking about research, actually, we're talking about the inclusion of this research to also in programs, in projects, nonprofit organizations that are using this information. How does that look like? And I know it can be a very heavy question, so feel free to think about it a little bit.
I think the future looks like more peer-to-peer based work, and also like destigmatization, like even all of us here together, like that's a really big step forward. And yeah.
On having us all here together, I think also in terms of the way that information and programs are put out, and like it hasn't really been centralized in any meaningful way, so it isn't as accessible as it could be, which is why it feels like a cool, like, here are all these projects, here are them actually talking to each other, with each other, that kind of thing. Because for me, at least, like, we know it's out there now. It's just a matter of like, can we actually reach it? Can we know all the different projects that are happening, and can we benefit from all those different projects?
Definitely. So yeah, the stigmatization is a big part, and accessibility too. Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I was going to say something about just the way that certain youth leaders are here to actually learn this information. We're the ones who are able to transfer that knowledge to the communities that we're all a part of after the fact. So even just beginning the conversation in a level that's as centralized as this, it's a terrific way for us to begin to share that knowledge with people who may not have come across these websites or even known that these programs exist yet.
Exactly. And I think that is one of the things that people are always thinking, like, how can we reach youth and they can see all this information? And we actually have one question for Eric Collins. And Eric is wondering, should Canada lower the legal age to purchase cannabis? Why or why not?
That's a really, oh, Alex, you go first. You go first.
No, please, Kia, go right ahead.
I was just gonna say that's a really tough question. Because if you look at like what it's, scientists or researchers say is reduce your cannabis use, like I guess delay reduce to like the age 25, but also like in Alberta you can purchase cannabis at the age of 18. In BC it's 19, and in Quebec it's 21. And when I was living in Quebec, I believe it was 18, and they moved it up to 21, which personally I don't necessarily agree with. I don't know if legal age necessarily helps in associated harm when it comes to consuming alcohol or weed. I think focusing on age, it's really like what age should we start talking to people about how to use cannabis safely? Like what age should we start having these conversations about mental health? At what age should we start talking to people about substances? I think like that's the most important question, because it is a really, really tough answer and it varies through province territory. I'd love to hear from other people though. I'm curious.
I was thinking something just along that line as well. It's just kind of age is the specific limitation that opens a floodgate of all sorts of opportunities for a person to now have at their fingertips, readily available. Cannabis, alcohol, the ability to vote. I mean, it shouldn't all be age dependent on who's able to access it, but I'm glad there's some kind of a widely understood system for us all to agree with, but still there has to be that information passed to people as they're building up to that point. So as you near the age of legalization, or we're having that actual access point, there has to be some sort of a basis of knowledge on what you're getting yourself into. So I think if we were to lower the age, well, I'm from Alberta, so the age is 18 here. It's pretty much a free-for-all in a lot of circumstances. It seems like put it even lower and you're just kind of inviting a lot of other people who may already have access to have more access.
I come from kind of the Quebec perspective because I was 18 and then it got switched to 21 within like 2 weeks of being able to purchase it. And I don't know, at least for me, like only being able to purchase at 21 just meant I wasn't able to moderate my use in the same way that I would be if I had legal channels to go through. So there's arguments to be made for and against, but also just being able to control your own use or determine your own use how you like, I think.
And just to add to like the Quebec legal age, I found it really confusing when I was living there because I could purchase alcohol at the age of 18, but I couldn't purchase cannabis until 21. So it feels like as a young person, there's like a favoritism towards a certain substance. So there's still that stigma around purchasing cannabis as a young person, where you have alcohol that's like more readily available. And as Emma was saying, it's harder to regulate your use and to understand what's in the weed that you're smoking if you're getting it from non-legal channels. So that was really frustrating for me.
I wonder if any other panelists have any thoughts about this question or what the other panelists have said as well.
Yeah, I sort of agree. It's kind of on a case by case basis because, like research has shown, smoking weed at a younger age can be harmful. But at the same time, if there's not proper channels to go through when you're a young person buying the product, you're gonna do it through more dangerous valleys. So it's just kind of a hard question. Yeah, like I'm in BC, so where I am, it's 19. But if it were to be 21 or over, I could see it becoming an issue, because like people said, you're able to purchase alcohol but not marijuana. So
I'm think not considered youth in this panel. So I'm a 30 plus. So respect to everyone here. I'm more conservative in my approach, straight up. Not to be the bad guy here. I started smoking when I was young, and it did not do me any favors. I'm the seeker. I wanted to know what the feeling was, and I always ask youth, what are you looking for in the experience as I work with them and coach people in high school and kids? What are you looking for? What do you want to experience? What moment are you in now that doesn't seem to be good enough? It's not about escape. It's not about escape, but it's like, oh, weed makes me feel lighter. It makes me laugh more. It makes the pain go away. So obviously something in the moment isn't good enough for you to want something else. So to come to terms with that educational piece too, but there's an easy way to stop every single car accident in the world. We don't need to get in any more accidents. We just have to drop the speed limit to 5 kilometers per hour everywhere in Canada. That's all we got to do. But we don't. We got to make it 80, 100, because people need to get to where they're going, and there's an associated risk that we're willing to deal with as human beings. We're willing to say this many people are going to die every year, and we're not willing to go down to 5 kilometers per hour. Scary and strange truth, isn't it? That we weigh risks like that. I don't think the solution is to lower the age of legal consumption. But that's easy for me to say because I don't know what the solution is. It's like straight up. So I'm offering you that. And then Scott, what else do you have to say? I don't know. So right now, obviously it's not perfect, but I think in this group and everyone attending and watching, education at this point, I'd say let's keep it 18, 19, but man, let's start talking about it when they're in grade 8, grade 7, grade 6. And let's just really amp up the education and harm reduction about it. Because we all know here in the room, legal or not, I'm getting my hands on some when I wanted it, piece of cake. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a recognition on your part, Scott, that it will be there, and that is true. We need to maybe make an emphasis on education. Yeah.
Yeah, emphasis on, we're emphasizing maybe the wrong pieces. Emphasis on government stability and regulation versus individual autonomy. I don't know if we can depend on legal age or not and what the government can do. It's still what happens at home, what happens in the classroom, what happens during these events, to really take responsibility there. It's just, as I said in the presentation, it's so complicated, which is why things like this are just so great.
Yeah, very nuanced. I think Danica, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, I pretty much completely agree with Scott, what you said. Like, there isn't really a fix to the issue, and all we can do is kind of prepare people better. And yeah, to the question, the whole question that was asked, is no, I don't think it should be lowered, the age. But like I said, I'm from BC, and the age here is 19, which I find like acceptable, like 18, 19. So.
Okay. Okay. And Michelle Fry wants to know, with the current federal Cannabis Act review, or the consultation is being open, what changes to the federal Cannabis Act would the members of the panel right now would like to see?
I've got a couple suggestions just as far as purchasing capability goes. So I know in Alberta in particular, certain levels of potency is limited in edibles to about 10 milligrams per unit. And I have lots of friends, myself included, who maybe don't start to feel the effects. Nothing begins to work towards the desired effect. I mean, towards whatever perceived effect you're looking towards, around like 40 or 50 milligrams. So maybe just a widening of the cap for the people who are a little bit more involved, much more used to these things, who have a higher tolerance, who just needed to go that little extra mile. So it's like an advanced quota of things that can be available. I would like to see some kind of a widening of that gap, especially for people who want to purchase more than 30 grams at a time. There's a maximum per transaction in this province. Whereas I know other provinces, a person who might live in a rural area can come into wherever the best cannabis dispensary is and be able to find 2 or 3 different ounces at a time. It's very much limited for people's accessibility around here. So I've noticed that a lot, especially as a bud tender, but now I'm noticing that a lot more as a frequent user.
Does anyone want to add to what Alex said about what changes would you like to see with the review of the Federal Cannabis Act?
Well, I was just gonna ask, it's kind of a side note, but I don't know like what the like market looks like in Alberta. Is it more privatized or is it like what are the cannabis stores like over there? Like you
Um,
said you're a bud tender?
I have been, yeah, for about 2 out of the 4 years, I've been a bud tender in
Okay.
legal cannabis.
Okay.
From what I've witnessed, there's been a lot of private markets. Some independents are able to pop up, but it's majority corporate owned dispensaries, I suppose. A lot of them have locations in Alberta and Ontario, from what I can see, but then it's still scattered all over the place based on availability. Like there's the specific Alberta market that will allow only certain companies to produce and sell in this area. So it's definitely on the private track of limiting resources.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cool. I was just curious. Thank you.
No worries.
I think I would just agree with the edible thing, to be quite honest. I feel like there's a lot of room for error when making sometimes home done edibles, which can lead to say bad experiences or worse experiences than you would have if you knew how much you were ingesting. And at least in Quebec, they've only just started selling edibles in terms of like beets and cauliflowers, so they're not appealing to children. So it's kind of weird in the first place, but like the 5 milligram limit, etc., is just not it's kind of like a weird, like, do you know your market? Like, how much do you know? It feels like it's mostly tailored to, which is good that they have smaller doses available for people, but for those who might be able to, but still want to know exactly how much they're ingesting, it would be nice.
Okay, yeah, so more product awareness. Okay, yeah, definitely. Do we want to add anything to this question?
I don't know if this would really fall under the question, but just for government stores that are selling cannabis, a lot of the times I find the prices are way higher, which is something that really deters people from going through that avenue. And also, a lot from my experience, a lot of the time it's been like dry, or it seems like it's been sitting there a long time. So, like me as a user, I personally don't even go through that avenue, just because what I found is it's just I guess not as good. But I don't know if that's something they could really fix or not. Yeah.
The price, okay. Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts? Okay, so we actually have a question from one of our speakers. Steve would like to know, what takeaway do you have you learned about cannabis that you feel was the most profound to you, or something that you found that resonated with you the most from the presentations?
The presentation that he did, I found that resonated most to me, just because it's all like youth ran, which I think is really cool. And just even the types of like imagery they were using, it was really like eye catching. And yeah, that's what I was most drawn to.
Okay, sorry, Steve just confirmed, just in general, not about the presentations. What have you learned about cannabis that has been the most profound in general, not about the presentations?
I guess something that I've learned like through my work and research is just like neuroplasticity and how the brain works and how like beautiful our brains are. Because I know when I was younger and I was consuming a lot of weed in high school, there was a lot of stigma around, oh, if you smoke weed, you're going to be brain dead. Like a lot of like kind of like ableist and like really stigmatizing language around my brain health. And then when I started doing my own research, I learned about like neuroplasticity and that our brain is always evolving and can change and has the ability to change. So I think like that has been really groundbreaking for me, especially during a time where I couldn't, or I didn't feel like I could open up to people about my cannabis use. And there was just a lot of stigma that I was facing, and realizing that like, our brains are always changing and my mental health is always changing. And so long as I can talk about it with people, peers, family, whoever, I will be okay for the most part. But yeah, the neuroplasticity part for me is really big.
This answer, I hope, isn't insulting to all the amazing presentations, but sometimes things just stick and you have no control over what sticks. The aluminum can just, it's stuck. I don't think we have any defined data about that. Maybe Get Sensible has more, but I am surprised that youth are still finding ways, obviously, unhealthy and healthy ways to consume. And I thought the aluminum can was old fashioned. I thought that was just my generation, and I was the bottled water guy with the pen and the aluminum foil, right? And you can find a bottle on the ground anywhere, and if you have a lighter, you're good. So that was surprising to me, and it was interesting. Which again, I think it just reconciles the work that we're doing, trying to do, and keep doing. Yeah.
It happens to everybody. Those desperate times call for desperate measures. I know I've had the occasion before. I had to carve a pipe out of a coconut because there was nothing else around. So things happen. It gets a little crazy out there, but hey, there's structural differences for all sorts of folks. Sometimes you have ease of access. Sometimes there's absolutely nothing around except the capability and a desire to get a little higher. Yeah, I definitely find cannabis to be more of an interpersonal experience for reasons such as that. Like you have all these things that you bring into the scenario that you want to share with your friends, and then all of a sudden you have this obstacle and impasse about like, how do we even consume it? So one thing that I definitely really appreciated with the presentations today was about just trying to get through the I guess the blockades that are still being put out there from different sources of stigma. Like there's all sorts of different mentalities and people are just trying to reach out and create community out of it. So it's really nice to see through all of that.
Though this is more of a takeaway from the presentations, because I would also agree with those points and Heath's points in the chat about I'm not surprised in the slightest that as maybe a younger stoner, that there are still many, many less healthy as well as healthier ways to consume. And I think that goes into a larger thing about stigmatization and all of that. And age of purchase and capacity like that. But I think the one presentation that actually stood out to me was I think the Weed Out the Risk one at the start with the like situational, different situations and targeting harm reduction strategies towards that, because that wasn't so present even when I was a little bit younger. And it's good to see that that's being taken into account a lot more.
Yeah, all those differences, right? Okay, so since time is coming, we are almost running out of time. So let's just do one more question. I guess we would like to know, could we know, dear youth expert panel, what is working and what is not working in terms of, I guess in this case, we're talking more about programs, the research that you have been involved in general. What is working and what is not working, or what would you like to see more of?
What's working, in my opinion, would be when working with any like studies I've done or just in the topic, like anyone here, I haven't felt stigmatized at all, which I think is a great thing. And I think it's really awesome that the government gives out grants for things like this to be done. And yeah, I think that's definitely working.
I would agree that it's awesome that the government gives out grants and stuff for this. And I think that is like the work that's been presented today is a testament to what is working. But I think it also goes back to Kia's point at the start that grants usually have end dates. And if this work wants to be continued to be done, like I would like to see it funded on a like very consistent and permanent basis so that it wouldn't, so that this is just the start instead of kind of a one little piece of it, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Okay, so yes, funding to keep these programs going. Yeah, definitely.
And another thing, like this is just based off of my experience, and I think like COVID also made it a bit difficult where we're working online virtually, but I think like having events and like panels like this are instrumental, like they're huge and extremely important. But what I'm trying to work on is to not get stuck in like an echo chamber, and for my outreach to go beyond like cannabis related organizations, but also just young people that are in the know about cannabis. Like people working in this field. But how do we get these resources out to all young people across Canada? And it was really interesting in Chelsea's presentation how she was talking about communities up north, how they don't have reliable internet, and they use different forms of media like the radio. And I was like, wow, that's actually such a genius idea of reaching out to those young people out there, just to be like, hey, if you want to check out this resource, or just different ways of mobilizing information around cannabis, just so that all young people do have access to this. That's like something that like I think a lot of organizations are working on right now.
Yeah, adapting to the specific demographic that you are trying to reach, right? And it can be so different. Are there any other thoughts before we move on?
Just a quick thought. I know, yeah, all the work is amazing that we're doing, and the funding thing makes me smile, Emma, because yeah, that's a tough one when we're at the end of these things. I just something came to mind. Something that's missing, I think, is today for youth when it comes to cannabis and emotional well-being is role models. I think the kids are missing someone to look up to. And you can see the proof of that when you see who comes to fame online and who they actually look up to almost by default. So just by hearing some of your stories and even hearing Daniel Barris, I could see that as a role model, as a success for a use of cannabis. Or we look at successes of not using cannabis and offering a sense of leadership in the space. I really think that's what youth are longing for and craving. And from my experience when I was a kid, that's really what I was craving too. It's conversations like this and someone who's been there, done it, and felt it.
Yeah, the life experience is important too. It's an important piece too. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so since we are almost at time, thank you, dear panel, for being here and answering our questions. Thank you so much. So now I'm just going to make sure that I'm just going to pass it on to Rebecca, who has some words for us. Okay, but thank you so much, youth expert panel, for being here with us today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I just want to sincerely apologize for our misstep at the beginning of this event because Michelle Robinson, who's an Indigenous community leader and my friend, she did not get a proper introduction and somehow her bio was not read. So because this is going to be recorded, I just want to share that Michelle Robinson is a Satu Dene woman with a weekly podcast in its 5th year called Native Calgarian. Her public Indigenous book club is over 6 years old, and she is a mother, public speaker, and advocate for Indigenous peoples and for truth and reconciliation, working with all levels of community and government groups. So I really encourage you to check out Michelle's podcast. I did an episode where we talked about cannabis harm reduction for youth, and she's someone I'm very happy to call a friend, and I'm so happy that she was here to give our land acknowledgement. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Rebecca, for that. Okay, so we are just at the end of our event. So if you have any other questions or any comments that you would like to make, just make sure that you use the chat function or the Q&A. I guess, Daniel, if you can close us off.
Sure. Thank you very much. And apologies for the oversight there on the introduction for Michelle. A couple of things just to wrap up with here. We are putting together a digital compendium of cannabis youth education projects. I believe you already received the booklet that we put together for this event, but we are looking to expand that. So if you're a part of any projects or aware of any projects, we would be interested in hearing from you. And you can email Anna with that, whose information you were sent along with the registration for that. In addition, we are looking to put together a special edition of the International Journal for Drugs Policy. And so we are looking to collect abstracts for that special edition that we're hoping to put together. Again, so if you know of or are part of any research projects or youth-led projects related to cannabis and harm reduction, we would love to hear from you. And again, Anna is your contact there. Anna, can you pop your email into the chat for everybody just so they have it right at hand there? And then we were supposed to have a few more minutes for connections and networking. So we will, I can stick around for a few minutes, and I won't make a claim for anybody else, but I'll stick around for a few minutes if there's questions or people want to leave this Zoom chat open to connect with anybody else. And then finally, I would just say that there's been a link to a survey put into the chat function for you. So we would really appreciate if you filled out that survey and let us know what you thought of the event and all the different presentations that were there. I think that's all the ground to cover for that. And just on, I'll let the other hosts jump in if they want to, but I'll just say, on behalf of myself and the Humber Center for Social Innovation, we really appreciate everybody coming out today and to participating for our participants there and for the questions that we got from the audience. As I said at the beginning, this is the kind of event that I don't think 5 years ago would have even really been possible to come out and say, let's talk about how to have young people have safer and better experiences while consuming drugs. I can imagine the old Simpsons meme. Won't somebody think of the children? Like just, and I would have done the Homer meme and like walked back into the bush. No, I never backed away from that fight. But I do think that we're hopefully moving past those times. And I think the presentations we've seen here today all highlight I think genuine, not just appreciation, but involvement and leadership that we're taking from young people. And I have to say, I don't feel like I'm no longer a young person. I just turned 40. And then I realized that I'm not getting invited to the youth panels anymore. That's not my voice, but it's interesting because I feel like I have so much to share, but I realize more and more that my voice isn't the right voice to design and build these things. And it is so heartening to see all of the work that is being done by young people and just the amazing capacities and capabilities that they're continuing to demonstrate. And I'm continually blown away by it and not at all surprised at the same time. So thank you everybody today, panelists and participants and attendees. Thank you everybody for coming in person and for being here online. This is a really great event to put on and to plan. And I'm so excited that you all showed up and came to make it so special. Thank you very much.